Hi everyone, welcome to the closing video lecture for week 8. Here we're going to continue our analysis of the perpetrator-victim paradox by looking at a couple of case studies. First, the Rwandan genocide, and then the Holocaust. And actually, we're not really looking at these case studies in and of themselves, but rather we're trying to extract some generalizable, theoretical implications. Moreover, we're going to see how a certain post-colonial theory of genocide can be imaginatively applied to the Holocaust. Reading 5 this week is by anthropologist Mahmoud Mamdani, who is Ugandan-born of Indian descent. Here he offers an ethno-historical account of the Rwandan genocide. Really, the Rwandan genocide itself isn't a central focus of this book. He sets it up here in the introduction, which we're reading, and only returns to it in one of the final chapters. Really, the bulk of the book is concerned with the deeper levels of history, going back to pre-colonial Rwanda, then to European colonization, then to post-colonial independence, before finally arriving at the 1994 genocide itself. Now, we're just reading the introduction, where he lays out his basic argument. Moving on, reading 5 is by Israeli-American historian Saul Friedlander, with what is perhaps his most seminal contribution to Holocaust studies, with his chapter on redemptive anti-Semitism. This concept is appropriated and retooled in reading 6, which is yet another piece by Australian historian Dirk Moses, who combines Friedlander's notion of redemptive anti-Semitism with the post-colonial theory of genocide that's introduced by Mamdani in reading 4. So like I said, reading 4 comes from the introduction of Mamdani's book on the Rwandan genocide. We'll probably read another selection from this book in the spring when I teach genocide in the modern world. But what follows is his conceptual and theoretical argument. He begins by considering the relationship between colonialism and genocide, which he breaks down into 2 types. First, there were settler genocides against natives. By settler, he's referring to a type of political identity that's associated by the European colonial conquest of the Americas, Africa, and beyond. This historical pattern of conquest often involved colonial genocide against native peoples, and by natives, he's essentially referring to the political identity opposite the settler. In other words, settler means colonizer, whereas native means colonized. Anyways, an example of this first type of colonial genocide is the 1904 German genocide against the Herero people in Southwest Africa. I'll talk about this case next semester, along with other cases of settlers' genocide. But what Mamdani is interested in is the second type of colonial genocide, natives genocide. This type of genocide involves the uprising of natives against their colonial masters, when victims become killers, hence the title of his book. Mamdani's argument here builds on the seminal post-colonial theory of Frantz Fanon, the political radical, Pan-Africanist, and Marxist humanist who was concerned with the psychopathology of colonization, as well as the human, social, and cultural consequences of decolonization. Fanon's 1961 classic, The Wretched of the Earth, put forth an interpretation of post-colonial violence and national liberation. Because colonialism is inherently violent and dehumanizing against the colonized, the latter is said to achieve liberation only through a revolutionary form of counter-violence, that is, violence against the settler. For the colonized people, this violence, argued Fanon, has certain positive and creative qualities. Indeed, this violence was life-affirming and redemptive. For the native, Fanon added, life can only spring up again out of the rotting corpse of the settler. So what does this have to do with the 1994 Rwandan genocide? Mamdani argues that the political polarization between the Hutu and the Tutsi can only be understood in the historical context of colonialism. Essentially, it stems from a divide-and-conquer strategy of the Belgian colonizers. Prior to colonial rule, the terms Hutu and Tutsi did not designate distinct ethnic groups, let alone opposing racial identities. Rather, these terms represented more fluid socioeconomic categories that were closely interrelated through a common identity based on a common language. Yet the Hutu were a demographic majority, and the pre-colonial Rwandan polity was ruled by a Tutsi minority, the latter of which were co-opted into the colonial administration of the Hutu. This political arrangement was ideologically legitimized through a highly racist myth called the Hamitic hypothesis, which said that the Tutsi descended from the children of Ham, or Noah's cursed son in the Hebrew Bible, and as such, they were said to be racially superior to the Hutu, who were supposedly indigenous to this part of Africa. By 1962, when Rwanda became an independent state, these racialized categories continued to harden into polarized political identity. Thus, according to the scheme, the Hutus saw themselves as natives, who could only achieve full independence by killing not the Belgians, who eventually left anyways, but the Tutsi, who were instead seen as settlers, an invasive force that supposedly threatened to destroy the indigenous Hutu. We'll read all about this next semester, but our present concern isn't really about the Rwandan case per se. Rather, it's this theory of natives genocide that we're concerned with. As we'll see, we can apply this theory in creative ways to the Holocaust. More on that in Reading 6. In order to set that up, however, let's turn to Reading 5, where Friedlander offers redemptive anti-Semitism as the key explanatory concept at the core of the Holocaust. So what does he mean by this? Friedlander disentangles the various threads of anti-Semitism that were inherited from the late 19th century. Before this, of course, there had been a long-standing belief of Jewish plots against Christians. Most notoriously, there was the blood libel accusations of the medieval era, this utterly fantastical and hallucinatory myth that Jews needed Christian babies for ritualistic purposes. Such conspiratorial thinking was revised in the modern era, with the notion that the Jews were somehow behind the Freemasons or the Illuminati, secret societies that ostensibly challenged and threatened what was then the ascendant political form of nationalism. Similarly, there was this notion that the Jews were behind the scenes of international finance. Indeed, this latter notion is still around today. But what all of these notions have in common is the idea that the Jews represented some sort of hidden menace, a traitorous and subversive threat. By the late 19th and early 20th century, this legacy of conspiratorial thinking reached new levels in Germany with a confluence of circumstances. Firstly, since the late 19th century, the rapid process of modernization in Germany dramatically transformed the country's social structures and threatened its existing hierarchies. Indeed, the very notion of modernity is defined in opposition to tradition. As such, the self-proclaimed bearers of tradition see agents of modernity, especially those groups that prosper or benefit from modernization, as ostensible threats that challenge their cherished cultural values. Secondly, Germany was defeated during World War I with its armies on foreign territory. The fact that the war never reached German soil left many Germans reeling from the seemingly inexplicable lost war. Thus, many Germans gravitated towards the stab in the back myth, or the notion that Germany didn't lose their war on the battlefield, but because they were sabotaged and betrayed by civilians on the home front, supposedly, especially by Jewish war profiteers. Finally, there was the specter of the Bolshevik Revolution, a dramatic wave of political upheavals that promised to completely upend the traditional order of the world. All of these factors combined to create an apocalyptic mood in the post-World War I moment, this idea that the world as we knew it was coming to an end. Enter the Nazis as a millenarian movement, and Hitler as a figure promising redemption. And Hitler as a messianic figure promising redemption. Etymologically, millenarianism is based on the notion of 1,000 years. It's no surprise, therefore, that the Nazis dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich. Anyways, as a political concept, this refers to movements that are based on an apocalyptic timetable, believing that some turning point in the grand cycle of history is somehow imminent, and with it the end of the world as we know it. Thus, according to the Nazis' apocalyptic worldview, the eternal struggle between the Aryan and the Jew was reaching a climax, and the Jews, according to this utterly fantastical and hallucinatory worldview, were on the verge of utterly destroying the Aryan race. Thus, Hitler promised to save the Germans from their supposedly imminent demise, and in doing so, in the fashion of a false prophet, he further promised to deliver a whole new world, a utopia, a complete rebirth of society. hence the notion of redemption. This, argues, was the appeal of Nazi anti-Semitism. Reading 6 combines Friedlander's thesis of redemptive anti-Semitism with Fanon's theory of post-colonial violence and national liberation. To begin with, Moses puts Friedlander's thesis in historiographical context. Along with Friedlander, Yehuda Bauer is perhaps the most well-known scholar from a body of scholarship that has emphasized the centrality of anti-Semitism in both the Holocaust and Nazism, both of which are thus considered unique because of its millenarian, because of its spiritual nature that transcended pragmatic concerns. In turn, this cohort has argued against an alternative thesis that stresses the social and economic, that is to say, pragmatic or material aspects of Nazism and the Holocaust. Moses actually tries to bridge these two theses. Much like Semelin in Lesson 8a, Moses uses the concept of the imaginary to see how the hallucinatory worldview of the perpetrators was rationalized. His argument is that the Nazis were influenced by what he calls the European cultural imaginary. This cultural imaginary cohered or came together during what Moses has elsewhere called the racial century, roughly from the mid-19th through the mid-20th century, when the paradigmatic assumptions behind European colonialism infused Western politics writ large. World politics was thus understood at this time in accordance with a harsh, brutal, and ultimately racist meta-narrative about progress, domination, and conquest. As Moses puts it, the political imaginary of a zero-sum struggle between peoples was virtually ubiquitous at the time. In Wilhelmian Germany, during the so-called Second Reich, the late 19th, early 20th century, the question that German academic elites were asking was, how do we compete, indeed survive, in an international system of states and empires in which we are such late starters? One consequent anxiety was biopolitical, he argues. British settler colonies, the US, Canada, Australia, had become home to millions of German settlers who rapidly assimilated at the expense of global Germandom. Of course, the overseas German Empire was dismantled after World War I, and by the Third Reich, German colonial visions had transformed into what we know as the Lebensraum theory. In that sense, we can see the Nazi occupation regime as a form of colonialism. Thus, using Mamdani's distinction, we could see the Nazi occupation of, say, Poland or Luxembourg as forms of colonizers' genocide. But Moses isn't really concerned with that. Rather, he's essentially arguing that the Holocaust specifically was, at least from the perspective of the Nazi elite, a form of what Mamdani identifies as a natives' genocide. In other words, many Germans regarded themselves as an indigenous people who were being slowly colonized by foreigners, namely Jews. The cult of indigeneity was signaled by the Volkish obsession with ancient German tribes. Now, of course, this ideology belies the fact that Jews had been in Europe for centuries, not to mention the fact that Germany was never really colonized at all, by anyone, at least not since the Roman Empire. But the whole point of our lesson this week has been that when it comes to the paranoid worldview of the perpetrators, reality is besides the point. Rather, it's about how reality is ideologically misceived. Thus, taking Hitler's rhetoric seriously, many Germans at the time experienced National Socialism as a form of national liberation, Moses argues. Moses thus combines Frantz Fanon's post-colonial theory of violence with Friedlander's notion of redemptive anti-Semitism. That, in a nutshell, is Moses's admittedly controversial argument, which is a perfect exemplar of the perpetrator-victim paradox. Okay, and that's it for Lesson 8b. As usual, your 8th and final discussion form assignment is due at the end of the week, on Tuesday, October 23rd, which is technically the last day of the semester. However, final grades aren't due until the following week, so I want to give you at least a little bit of extra time to finish up your 2 remaining assignments. So in the first place, you have Analytical Essay Number 2. I'm giving you a 48-hour extension on this assignment, so it's due by the end of Thursday, October 25th. Remember, with the Analytical Essay assignment, You can choose any of the latter 4 weeks, that's to say weeks 5 through 8. Also, Dissertation Project Part 3 has a 48-hour extension as well, also due on Thursday, October 25th. Please note that I will not be accepting any papers after this point, as my goal is to submit final grades by the following day, Friday. In closing, let me say what a pleasure it's been this semester. I'm really looking forward to next semester, as we'll all meet again with Genocide in the Modern Era. In the meantime, please don't ever hesitate to reach out to me if you ever want to talk about your work. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.